Echoes of Wisdom comes at a time of uncertainty for the Legend of Zelda series. Rather than continuing the massive, fully open-ended world of the previous two entries, this title seeks to pare the scale back, with a top-down view similar to A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. But don't mistake this smaller scale for lower ambition, because while Echoes of Wisdom looks like a traditional Zelda, it couldn't be more contemporary. It's an old-school game with modern sensibilities. But these very present-day aspects of it go beyond just a fresh coat of paint. On the surface, it might appear to be the type of game you've seen from the Zelda series many times before, but in reality, it may act as a prototype for many games that are yet to be created. It doesn't always achieve what it attempts, but things that are the first of their type rarely do. So let's explore what makes Echoes of Wisdom the newest old Zelda game. First, let's talk about the surface level stuff. Echoes of Wisdom looks and feels like a very current game, even more so than the Link's Awakening remake. The most obvious reason might be the UI, which at times can feel like it's ripped straight from Tears of the Kingdom. The way the quests pop up, how the objective marker looks, and the fact that you can place pins and stamps on the map all give it a very modern feel. Players of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom will also find many of the locations to be familiar. There's Elden Volcano, Hebra Mountain, Hyrule Field, Gerudo Desert, Faron Wetlands, Kakariko Village, and Lake Hylia, all of which appeared in those two games. Of course, they're very different in this iteration, but the use of these names again is definitely deliberate. Getting around the map is also simpler than past 2D Zeldas, thanks to a large number of waypoints you can fast travel to. This is a great addition, so you don't have to trek back and forth across the map if you're not in the right section. These waypoints even appear in dungeons as well, which is a very welcome change. The dungeons might not be as big as some in the traditional 3D Zelda games, but not having to walk back through the empty rooms you've already beaten is much appreciated. There's also the addition of side quests, which feel so modern in a top-down Zelda, it's a bit surreal. A lot of them are pretty basic, just an NPC asking you to show them a specific echo. But they are nice to have peppered in between the main objectives, and reinforce Zelda as a hero for all the citizens of Hyrule, instead of just being out on her own quest. The NPCs also look very current, almost like little toy versions of the characters in more recent Zelda games. The King of Hyrule in particular looks just like a stylized version of the one from Breath of the Wild. They feature the same dash of voice acting that they have in those games as well, just some noises every few lines or so. This establishes that they do have a voice, you just don't hear it most of the time. And I think for a game like this, that's perfectly fine. Not every game needs full voice acting, but a little bit more personality added in this way makes a big difference. But enough about the condiments, let's get into the meat of the thing. The core gameplay in Echoes of Wisdom revolves around what the developers refer to as copy and paste. Copy an object from somewhere, paste it down somewhere else. This mechanic plays a role in everything you do in the game, from delivering objects to building ramps and staircases to fighting enemies. It all comes down to copy and paste. There's many objects to copy, but most of the time you'll be using table, wooden box, decorative shrub, and everyone's favorite, old bed. When it comes to traversal, building across gaps or up to a ledge, these are the ones you'll be using almost exclusively. There's other objects that come in handy in certain situations, but get used to these four. They'll be your best friends. Zelda can't do much on her own. Aside from summoning, the most she can manage is a short hop. But it's in her lack of abilities that the copy and paste gameplay is able to find its usefulness. Tears of the Kingdom had building too, and it's much more fleshed out. But the building in Echoes of Wisdom is more effective because it's more necessary. Between the ability to climb and the paraglider, Link doesn't need all that much assistance in traversal. Building something to help you get up to a certain point can help, but it's almost never needed. This is not the case for Echoes of Wisdom. Placing objects is an absolute necessity if you want to make any progress. You don't have the option to climb up a cliff, you have to build a set of stairs to get up there. In this way, building is much more of an integral gameplay mechanic here than in Tears of the Kingdom. That game has building, certainly, but Echoes of Wisdom is about building. Everyone remembers chopping down a tree to cross the gap in the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild. But then you never do that again because you have the paraglider. So through limiting Zelda's moveset, Echoes of Wisdom is able to circumvent the problem that these previous games faced. But placing objects is really only half the story, because on top of that, you can also place enemies. The Zelda series has a wide range of enemies that Echoes of Wisdom pulls from for the player to summon. So if you ever wanted to be friends with 4 spear moblins, this is the game for you. Similarly to summoning objects, some enemies will be better for certain situations. A basic moblin might do the job for a standard battle, but when you're underwater, you'll probably want to go with a fish, or to go after an airborne enemy, you might want some bats. Oh, right, I'm sorry, they're called keys. Keys, not bats, keys. I think there's something to be said about the general feeling of summoning a monster and having it fight for you. When combined with the hood that Zelda wears, it's easy to see her as a witch or a sorceress, conjuring enemies out of thin air to do her bidding. It's a unique combat system, and one not seen in any other Legend of Zelda game, or even Nintendo game. The way that combat functions pulls Echoes of Wisdom closer to the easy side of the difficulty scale. When summoning enemies to fight for you, you don't have to worry about attack patterns, aiming, or dodging. You just find a safe spot and watch the battle take place. This gives me the impression that Echoes of Wisdom is very much designed for a younger audience to be their entry point into the Legend of Zelda series. Despite popular belief, Nintendo isn't allergic to making hard games. Even Tears of the Kingdom had some more challenging parts that could absolutely destroy you if you go in unprepared. So Nintendo has their lineup of games that are intended for more experienced audiences. But Echoes of Wisdom is not one of them. From falling into bottomless pits not damaging you, to being able to fully heal anywhere by laying in a bed, to not even having to engage in combat, this is a very forgiving, accessible game. But while this non-combat combat system is great for those new to 2D Zelda, as someone who's played a good few of them, I don't think it was for me. Summoning an enemy to fight for me has some novelty to it, but like all novelties, it wore off rather quickly. Watching an NPC fight another NPC simply isn't as fun for me as actually getting into the action myself. Combine this with the fact that defeating most enemies in the overworld rewards you with a whopping 1 rupee, and I found myself skipping fights more often than not. There's an innate satisfaction that comes with hitting an enemy at just the right moment, which isn't present in Echoes of Wisdom. And this leads me to a larger problem I have with the Echoes that you can designate as this video's hot take. I think there's too many. There's over 100 objects and enemies to summon in the game, most of which serve a single purpose. In the first few hours of the game, I had a much better time using these echoes because I had less to sift through. But before long, after copying so many different things I came across, the amount of options became overwhelming. I understand why they included so many. You want to give the player a wide variety of tools at their disposal so that they can solve puzzles and win at combat in their own way. But after a while, each echo I copied didn't feel useful. It felt like they were adding to a seemingly endless list of things to scroll through to find what I want. A lot of the summons don't do quite enough to make them stand out from the others. The reason I mentioned the table, wooden box, decorative shrub, and old bed earlier is because they can be used to solve 90% of traversal scenarios. Why do I need all these other things when most of the time I can get by with just these 4? Combat runs into the same problem. Each new enemy you defeat lets you copy them, but most of the time I found myself just sticking with a few tried and true allies. I try out each new enemy once, maybe, and then just go back to what works. I do think that when a game gives players too many options, they can become overwhelmed and eventually discouraged. When playing a Zelda game, I want to spend my time exploring the world, not sorting through a menu to find enemy number 87. And unfortunately, with each echo you get, that adds all the more menu time. The developers included this large number of echoes in order to give the player more freedom. But ironically, I think this decision actually results in the player feeling like they have less freedom. With so many different echoes, and each one filling a specific function, that means that the scenarios it makes sense to use a certain one will be much more restrictive. If you have to light a torch, you'll know you need to use the fire enemy, and you don't have much choice about that. It's a much more context-sensitive approach than I think the developers had intended. It's definitely less restrictive than past Zelda games, but more restrictive than you might have expected going into it. I think the better thing to do here would have been to reduce the number of echoes, but make each one useful in multiple ways. For one thing, that would mean less time scrolling through menus, which is a plus by default. But also, I think the player would be encouraged to experiment more and try to use echoes in different ways. That leaves decisions up to the player, rather than having them just do what's required. The most modern thing about Echoes of Wisdom, though, is its format. Even though they might be wearing out their welcome among the gaming audience now, open world games have proven to be a massively popular genre in the modern era. Even games that previously haven't been open world ended up making the leap. From Software went open world, Sonic the Hedgehog went open world, and of course, The Legend of Zelda went open world, with Breath of the Wild. And so Echoes of Wisdom is also an open world game. It may not look like your standard open world experience, but I can prove to you that it is. In many 2D Zeldas of the past, your movement throughout the world was restricted by the items you have. Can't swim without the Zora flippers, can't jump over gaps without the feather, can't lift rocks without the power glove. But in Echoes of Wisdom, these restrictions do not exist. The reason for this comes down to the building mechanics. Again, a table, box, and old bed can get you pretty far if you know how to use them, so I decided to see just how far I could push it. After beating the second dungeon, I decided to ignore the main quest for the time being, and attempt to explore as much of Hyrule as possible, disregarding any notions of the intended pathway. I am, after all, a professional. I found I was able to explore basically all of the map, just a couple hours into the game. Here's what my map screen looked like after this adventure. The only area I couldn't get to was the very top of Hebra Mountain, and I'm sure someone who's more clever with their decorative shrub placement than I am could make it there. But aside from this small portion, everything else is open-ended and accessible. I waded through the Fair and Wetlands. I saved a horse for the ranch. I bobbed for acorns near Hyrule Castletown. I climbed up Elden Volcano. I froze my pants off on Hebra Mountain. And finally, I got killed a bunch of times in the Eternal Forest. In order to get to all of these places relatively early in the game, I made heavy use of staircase building, and ended up in a lot of areas I wasn't entirely supposed to be in. There's a satisfying feeling you get when climbing so high up on the treetops that it becomes hard to see because of the clouds. The giddy, I'm not supposed to be doing this feeling you get when breaking a rule. But that only happens when there are rules to break. So yes, I can confirm that The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom is an open world game, just as much as Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. But does it benefit from being an open world game as those two do? That's another story. There should be more to exploring an open world than just fog surrounding you when you're on the highest treetops. But for this one, there isn't that much to do. When exploring after the second dungeon, I was able to do a few side quests, explore some caves, and defeat new enemies to learn them as echoes. But aside from the self-imposed challenge of seeing as much of the world as possible, there wasn't really anything pulling me to do so. Even when I was able to complete a quest and get some sort of reward, they weren't anything special. Usually just some rupees or a smoothie ingredient. A lack of meaningful rewards for explanation is a criticism that's often levied at Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I think Tears of the Kingdom is a bit better about it, but it is a point I think is valid. However, these two games still manage to be rewarding despite this, unlike Echoes of Wisdom. But why? Well, the reason is simple. It's the camera angle. In Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the camera is fully controllable by the player, so they're able to use it to look off in the distance and find points of interest. These capture an incredibly fun gameplay loop. See something cool far away, journey over and investigate it, and repeat. This is only possible because you can see in the distance, which isn't the case for Echoes of Wisdom. There's definitely some points in favor of using a top-down view like this game does. More clarity during combat and understandable level geometry are big pluses, but the open world format is not one. But I want to be fair here. Echoes of Wisdom was certainly not marketed as an open world game, and I don't think many players are going in expecting that out of it. When I was exploring around after the second dungeon, I was surprised that it was as open as it is. I was fully expecting to be walled off from major portions of the map, unable to access them until I got some certain echo or ability. But that never happened, and that's a bit of a problem. One thing that I very much enjoy about the 2D Zeldas is the progression. Go to a new area and get an item that allows you to get to other new areas. It's been done time and time again, but it's a tried and true system. A lot of Zeldas are essentially top-down Metroidvanias in this way, so without that factor in Echoes of Wisdom, it does feel like there's something missing. There's a great feeling of satisfaction you get when unlocking a new area in a Zelda game. It feels like you've achieved something and become more powerful through your hard work. But sadly, that's not a feeling that's present in this game. Going anywhere right off the bat is neat enough, but more boundaries that you can work to get past can be more fulfilling. When Echoes of Wisdom was in development, the team sought to allow the player to be mischievous by doing things that feel like cheating. And I'm all for this, but I don't think they went about it in the right way. In order to feel like you're cheating, you have to break the rules. And in order to do that, there have to be rules to break in the first place. The design team ended up removing many of the restrictions that had first been implemented over the course of development in order to give the player more freedom. And more freedom is great, but you've got to have limits somewhere. If you can do everything, what's the point of anything? But like any top-down Zelda, the overworld is just a portion of the experience. Many Zelda games feature a secondary world that's mirrored from the main one. Think the Dark World in A Link to the Past, time traveling in Ocarina of Time, or shrinking down in Minish Cap. Echoes of Wisdom doesn't quite have the entire secondary world in the same way that A Link to the Past does, but it does have these stilled worlds. These are areas that you venture into often throughout the game, and feature more linear gameplay than that of the overworld. Even if your objective is to explore an area, it's usually not a large one, and there's a definite flow to how you move throughout it. Sometimes, the stilled worlds are a straight point A to point B, when they lead up to a dungeon. While I'm not a traditional dungeon hater, I am a traditional dungeon disliker. A lot of the ones I've gone through in the older 3D Zeldas just felt too long, and not interesting enough to hold my attention for the duration. But these dungeons? I like these dungeons. For one thing, they're much shorter than the dungeons of many 3D Zeldas. Most can be completed within an hour unless you get stuck, but it's the more restricted nature of them that really makes them work. These dungeons should feel familiar to longtime Zelda players, with each room having some little puzzle that will lead you to the next room. And here's where the blend of environmental limitations with player freedom come together in a great way. You're given a series of narrow objectives, but how you get there is up to you. This is where it feels fun to break the rules and solve puzzles in a way that maybe the designers didn't intend. So while I don't think the open world overworld benefits from being as open as it is, the stilled worlds and the dungeons absolutely show what works so well about this freedom-centric design philosophy. Don't give the player no rules and let them run wild. Give them rules, but allow them to break them. This is the type of gameplay that, beyond just being well executed in these sections of Echoes of Wisdom, I think can set the stage for the future of the Zelda series, and hopefully video games as a whole. So I know I've been throwing out a lot of criticisms in this video, but I want to be clear, I do like this game. I wouldn't have played it in the first place if I didn't think I would enjoy it, and I wouldn't be making a video on it if I didn't find it interesting. There's a lot that this game does that other developers should learn from. The way it lets you approach problems in your own way is great, the visuals are endlessly charming, the music is delightful, it's all very well done. But at the same time, no game should be shielded from critical analysis. This is the Legend of Zelda. You couldn't put this series on a higher pedestal than it is. This is the franchise that redefined what video games could be, and then redefined it again, and then redefined it again, and then redefined it again. Zelda has a pedigree more impressive than almost any other series, so I go into each new game with very high expectations, and I'm not afraid to say when those expectations aren't met. It's interesting, because the most praised games in the Zelda series might also be the most criticized, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I consider both games to be fantastic, and some of my all-time favorites, but many others don't feel the same way. I've seen them responded to with so much clamoring for the return of traditional Zelda, with unlockable abilities, unbreakable weapons, and of course, classic dungeons. I don't particularly agree with these desires. For one thing, I like the breaking weapons, because I think they do a great job of forcing variety into the combat. I also love the shrines in the newer games. They're the perfect way to encourage exploration while rewarding problem solving. But Echoes of Wisdom keeps with Nintendo's convention of zigging when many members of the community want them to zag. Because instead of putting old Zelda into new Zelda, they put new Zelda into old Zelda. And while I think the results could have been better, I enjoy the end product, and I applaud the innovation. While I understand the desire to have more of what you already like, what makes me a Zelda fan is the fact that each game of the series is different. I love that Wind Waker, Breath of the Wild, and Echoes of Wisdom can all be part of the same series, but all play so differently. With so many games out there providing the same experience as past games in their series, or just the same experience as many other franchises, I'm always looking for titles that are new and original. And in this regard, the Zelda series is one you can always count on to deliver. The next Zelda game, whether it be 2D, 3D, 4D, or 1D, will likely be nothing like Echoes of Wisdom, and I'll be here for it.